Okay, so you guys wanted a deep dive into a religious movement, one that's been causing a bit of a stir. And let me tell you, the stuff you sent us, it's like a rabbit hole. We're talking IoT, Mr. Jaitani, right? Or the Science of Identity Foundation, as they're also known.
That's the one.
And at the center of it all, there's this guy, Chris Butler.
Though he goes by Jagad Guru Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa within the movement. Bit of a mouthful, huh?
Yeah, a bit. But anyway, you sent us a real mix of stuff on this group. Books, like excerpts from their teachings, internal documents even, plus social media posts, news articles, forum discussions, the whole shebang.
A real smorgasbord of perspectives.
Exactly. It's like we're piecing together a puzzle, trying to see the bigger picture. So, mission objective for this deep dive: figure out what makes this movement tick, what they believe, how they operate, and why they're attracting so much attention, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
Crucial to keep in mind, we're here to analyze, not to judge.
100%. So kicking things off, their whole origin story, it seems pretty tied to the founder himself, this Chris Butler or Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa. But his path to starting the Science of Identity Foundation, it wasn't exactly a straight line, was it?
No, not quite. What we're seeing from the sources is that Butler was part of that whole counterculture movement back in the 60s. Peace, love, and all that. Then he finds his way to the Hare Krishnas. Becomes pretty prominent within the movement, actually.
Huh, interesting.
But then, fast forward a bit, 1977 to be exact, he breaks away and establishes his own group.
Wow, that's quite a leap. What caused that split? It's not like people just ditch the Hare Krishnas every day to go start their own thing.
Well, that's where the whole guru concept comes in. It's not just your average teacher-student relationship in this context. The guru is seen as this direct link to the divine, often requiring, total devotion, even obedience from followers.
I see. So where does Butler fit into all of this?
The sources suggest he felt like his teachings were drifting away from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism. That's the specific branch of Hinduism the Hare Krishnas follow. Claimed he had this unique grasp on self-realization, placing the whole idea of identity at the core of his teachings. Hence, the Science of Identity.
So the name isn't just some catchy title, it's baked into their beliefs.
Exactly.
But this drifting away you mentioned, what did that actually look like? Different rituals or something deeper?
It really gets to the core of their whole ideology.
Yeah.
See, Gaudiya Vaishnavism, they heavily emphasize bhakti, devotion, expressed through things like chanting, temple worship, serving the guru, that sort of thing.
Right, makes sense.
Now, Butler's teachings, at least from what we're gathering from these sources, they kind of shifted the focus more towards individual self-realization through meditation, understanding your true spiritual identity. Subtle difference maybe, but significant.
So less about communal worship, more about looking inward.
You got it.
That might explain why he decided to go his own way, establish a separate path,
Could be.
But let's be real, the sources don't exactly shy away from the controversy surrounding Butler himself. And some of the accusations, those are pretty serious.
Yeah, there's no getting around it. Butler is a divisive figure, particularly within Hindu circles. There are claims of financial impropriety swirling around. Some sources even say he got funding from a convicted drug dealer back in the 70s.
Wait, hold on. A drug dealer bankrolling a spiritual leader. That's not something you hear every day.
Right. And this guy, Patrick Bowler, he went by Paramahamsa Das within the movement.
It's a lot to unpack, for sure. And are those the only accusations being thrown around?
Sadly, no. Some sources claim he's misused donations for personal gain, funding business ventures, especially that down-to-earth health food chain. There are links to the movement there.
Right. Down to earth, yeah.
And some point to Butler's lifestyle, saying it clashes with his whole image as this spiritual renunciate.
So a disconnect between what he's preaching and how he's living.
Potentially. But, gotta be honest,
Yeah.
verifying these claims,
Yeah.
it's a minefield.
Yeah, I bet.
Many of them originate from ex-members, and the organization itself, they're not exactly known for being transparent.
Makes sense.
Hard to get a clear picture without access to their internal financial records,
Yeah, I get it. Still, the sheer volume of these accusations, even if they're hard to prove, it definitely raises some red flags.
Absolutely. Raises questions about accountability within the movement, for sure.
Totally agree. But shifting gears a bit here, one thing that really jumped out from all this material, it's this unexpected link to U.S. politics.
Ah, yes.
Specifically, Tulsi Gabbard.
Right, the former U.S. representative, presidential candidate.
Her connection to the Science of Identity Foundation is not just some casual thing.
Definitely not.
From what we're seeing, Gabbard was raised in the movement. Her parents are devoted followers of Butler, and some sources even connect her campaign contributions to the organization. It's like, whoa, where did that come from?
It's pretty significant. Makes you wonder about potential influence, right? Did Butler's teachings shape her political stances at all, particularly those socially conservative views? And this
Yeah.
goes way beyond just Gabbard, you know?
Oh, totally. It opens up this whole can of worms about religious beliefs and public life
Yeah,
and the possibility of undue influence.
exactly.
But before we go too far down that road, let's swing back to the science of identity itself. You mentioned earlier how they put so much emphasis on identity being the key to spiritual liberation. What does that actually mean for them?
At the heart of it, they teach that our true nature is as eternal souls, and that we're all connected to this supreme consciousness, which they identify with Krishna.
Okay.
They believe that by realizing this inherent spiritual identity, that's how we overcome suffering and find true happiness.
So it's about recognizing our true selves, which are already divine in a sense.
You could say that.
I can see the appeal. But how is this different from what traditional Hare Krishnas believe? Because they revere Krishna too, right?
They do. And that's where things get a little tricky. Because while there are shared elements, the science of identity takes a different approach.
In what way?
Well, traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism stresses bhakti yoga, the path of devotion, with practices like chanting Krishna's names, serving the guru as the main focus.
Okay.
Butler's teachings, they seem to lean more towards jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, you could say, with a lot of emphasis on self-realization through meditation and truly understanding one's spiritual identity.
So same destination, maybe, but different routes to get there.
Maybe. It's not just abstract philosophy, though, right?
Good.
The sources talk about specific practices within the movement, too.
Oh, right, right. So what are we talking about here? Do they live in communes, wear robes, chant all day long? What's the day-to-day experience like for a follower of this science of identity?
Well, it's not as cookie cutter as you might think. From what we're seeing in these sources, I mean, it's like any religious group, right? You're going to have a whole spectrum of experiences. Some former members talk about this really strong sense of community, finding purpose, growing spiritually within the movement. But then you have others who paint a much darker picture, talking about manipulation, even exploitation.
So a mixed bag, huh? Some find solace while others feel trapped. That's a really interesting dynamic.
It is. And it's important to remember, a lot of the negative stuff we're seeing, it comes from ex-members. It's possible, maybe even probable, that current members who are having positive experiences, they're just not as vocal. Or maybe their voices aren't getting amplified as much. It's something we often run into when researching these kinds of groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. Relying on just one side of the story can really skew things. But you mentioned specific allegations of exploitation. What exactly are we talking about here?
One of the most outspoken critics is this woman, Rama Ranson. She's a former member, and she alleges, widespread child abuse, manipulation within the movement. Claims there was forced labor, intense pressure to donate huge sums of money, and this culture of silence around anyone who disagreed with the leadership.
Whoa, those are some serious accusations. Have there been any external investigations or legal action taken to corroborate her claims?
It's hard to say for sure. I mean, Ranson has definitely been sharing her story on her blog, social media, interviews, but the movement denies everything completely.
Mm.
And from the sources you provided, it doesn't look like there's been any formal legal action taken against them.
So it's kind of a he said, she said situation.
Pretty much, which, makes it incredibly difficult to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah, I bet. Aside from Ranson's accusations, though, are there any other, red flags that pop up in the sources? Any patterns of concern?
There are a few themes that keep popping up. Some ex-members describe this practice called love bombing. It happens during the recruitment phase, apparently.
Love bombing.
Yeah. It's this tactic some groups use to create this intense, almost overwhelming feeling of belonging, acceptance, which makes it really hard for people to question things or leave later on.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. It's like they shower you with so much love and attention, you feel like you finally found your people, your tribe.
Exactly. And on the surface, it might seem harmless enough, but love bombing can be a powerful tool for manipulation, especially when it's combined with other control tactics.
Makes sense. So manipulation's one thing. What about this financial pressure you mentioned?
Right. So there are allegations of that, too.
Yeah.
Members being strongly encouraged to donate heavily, sometimes beyond their means even.
Okay, so starting to see a pattern here. A charismatic leader with a questionable past, allegations of financial shadiness, mixed experiences from members. This is getting pretty heavy.
It is.
And we haven't even touched on the internal conflicts, the splinter groups within the movement. What's the deal with those?
That's where things get really interesting. You get a glimpse into how these guru-centric movements operate. There's often this huge emphasis on lineage, spiritual authority, leads to all these questions. Who's the true successor? Whose interpretation of the teachings is the right one? And let me tell you, it can get messy.
It's like a spiritual Game of Thrones, competing claims to the throne of enlightenment.
You got it.
So, did something like this happen within the Science of Identity Foundation?
Oh, absolutely. The sources point to this major conflict between Butler and one of his former members, this guy named Mahabhava Dasa.
Mahavadasa.
Yeah. He ends up leaving the Science of Identity Foundation to follow a different guru entirely, this Srila Bhaktivedanta Narayana Maharaja.
Wow, a full-on spiritual breakup. What caused the rift? Were they arguing about, like, the best way to meditate or something?
Nah, it was way more fundamental than that.
Yeah.
See, Mahabhava Dasa argued that Butler's teachings were straying too far from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Same concern some of those critics we talked about earlier have.
So back to that drifting away thing.
Yep. He felt that this Narayana Maharaja was the real deal, a more authentic representative of that lineage, closer to the original teachings.
A clash over authenticity. Who holds the keys to the true path? It's an age-old story, really. So what happened to Mahavadasa after he left? Did he start his own rival group?
He did become a pretty big name within Narayana Maharaja's following, and some of his supporters went with him, creating this splinter group. Happens all the time with these movements, disagreements over doctrine, leadership. They lead to factions, breakaways.
It's like a spiritual family tree branching out in all these unexpected directions.
It is.
Makes you wonder if these kinds of splits are just inevitable when you have a movement centered around one guru figure. Is it built into the structure, or is it just human nature playing out, even in a spiritual context?
It's a good question, right? Is it personality clashes, genuine differences in understanding, or maybe there's a power struggle going on beneath the surface? It highlights how complex spiritual authority can be, and how the human element, it's always there, even in movements that are striving for unity and enlightenment.
The irony isn't lost on me. But let's zoom out for a sec. We've covered a ton of ground here. A charismatic but controversial leader, unique takes on traditional beliefs, a surprising link to U.S. politics, and reports of both fulfillment and exploitation within the movement.
What are the big takeaways here? What are we left with after this deep dive?
I think the main thing is the Science of Identity Foundation. It's like a lot of these new religious movements. They don't fit neatly in any box. It's complex. You've got spiritual seeking, charismatic leadership, and then you've got these potential pitfalls when there's an imbalance of power. Not black and white then. More like shades of gray. Nuances to consider. And ultimately, it's up to each individual to form their own opinion. But what about the movement itself? Where do they go from here? I mean, they've been around for decades, but they still seem to fly under the radar for a lot of people.
That is interesting, isn't it? Despite the controversies, the internal conflicts, the Science of Identity Foundation, they've kept a dedicated following. And they've actually expanded globally. Makes you wonder, what's their secret? How have they managed to stay relevant, influential for so long?
Maybe it's the message itself. The promise of self-discovery, connecting to something bigger than yourself. Or maybe it's that strong sense of community they offer, which, let's face it, can be really appealing in a world that often feels pretty isolating.
Those are definitely factors. But I don't think we should underestimate their outreach. They're media savvy. They've been really smart about using technology, social media, to spread their message, attract new followers.
Think about those Wailana yoga videos. They're everywhere.
Exactly. It's a brilliant way to introduce people to their philosophy, their practices, in a way that's not intimidating. It's accessible. And it seems to be working. They've managed to kind of integrate into mainstream culture, but still keep their unique identity.
Like, they've bridged the gap between the spiritual and the worldly, the ancient and the modern.
It's a fascinating blend.
It is. But with their involvement in things like politics, business, it does make you wonder, how will they continue to adapt, to evolve?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
Will they become more mainstream, or will they retreat further into their own little bubble? Will they face more scrutiny as their influence grows, or will they stay under the radar?
It's a total choose-your-own-adventure for a religious movement.
And I have a feeling things are just getting started.
Yeah, I think you're right. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious, we've talked a lot about the controversies, the negative stuff. Are there any positive takeaways from the Science of Identity Foundation's approach?
That's a great point. It's important to remember, even within groups that are controversial, there can be valuable insights, practices that are worth considering. Like, for example, their emphasis on self-awareness, meditation, connecting with your inner self. Those are things that are widely recognized as beneficial for mental health, emotional well-being, regardless of your religious beliefs.
So even if you don't buy into the whole package, there might be pieces worth exploring on their own.
Absolutely. And their focus on living consciously, ethically, vegetarianism, environmental awareness, that stuff aligns with values that are like super important today.
Yeah, for sure.
It reminds us that even within groups we might disagree with, there can be common ground, shared aspirations.
I really like that perspective. It's easy to fall into that us versus them trap, but at the end of the day, we're all in this together, right? Trying to make sense of things. And maybe we can learn from each other, even if it's just how not to do things.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about approaching these topics with curiosity, thinking critically, and a willingness to look beyond the surface.
Exactly. We're not here to judge. We're here to understand. And speaking of understanding, I think we've covered a ridiculous amount of ground in this deep dive. What a ride, huh?
It really has been quite the exploration. We started with their origins, their controversial leader, this unique mix of traditional and unorthodox beliefs, the variety of experiences reported by members.
We even went into the world of U.S. politics
Yeah,
and all that complexity around lineage and spiritual authority. It's been a truly comprehensive deep dive, wouldn't you say?
I would say so. But like with any deep dive, there's always more to uncover. I think we should leave our listener with something to think about, something to ponder.
Okay, I like it. Lay it on us.
Given the science of identity foundations, ability to blend spirituality with worldly affairs, how will they continue to shape the world around them? And how will the world shape them?
Is this a glimpse into how religious movements are adapting in a globalized, interconnected society? That's a really interesting question. It's like we're leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for our listeners to follow. Encourage them to keep exploring, to form their own conclusions.
That's the goal. Because the most valuable thing you get out of a deep dive like this isn't a set of answers. It's that spark of curiosity, a desire to learn more.
Well said. And on that note, we'll say goodbye to our listener for now. But remember, the journey doesn't stop here. Keep those minds working, those questions coming, and who knows what you'll discover along the way. It's amazing how they've managed to, keep up with the times, using social media, online platforms to get their message out there, reach people all over the world.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive taking ancient wisdom and making it, digital friendly.
Exactly, making it available to anyone with an internet connection.
Right.
It's a smart strategy when you think about it, meeting people where they are, on their phones, their computers, instead of waiting for them to show up at some temple or ashram.
And it's working, that's for sure. Look at Wailana, Butler's wife. Her yoga videos, her products, they're huge. Millions of people are getting exposed to their ideas, their practices through her.
It's subtle, but it's effective. You start with a yoga video to de-stress, and next thing you know, you're exploring a whole new worldview.
It happens. And it goes beyond yoga, too. They've got this whole network of businesses, health food stores, media outlets, all pushing their message, bringing in money. It's like a self-sustaining machine.
So it's not just about spiritual enlightenment then, it's about economic power too. That's a whole other dimension to this.
It is, and it makes you think about their motives. Are they just trying to spread a spiritual message? Or is there something else going on, some desire for worldly influence mixed in there?
It's a tough question, isn't it? Especially with a leader as charismatic as Butler at the helm. The Science of Identity Foundation, they really seem to embody that tension between the spiritual and the material.
Yeah, they do. And it reflects a bigger conversation happening in society today, right?
Mm.
How do we deal with faith, power, influence, especially in a world where information spreads so fast?
It's something we all have to wrestle with no matter what we believe. And the Science of Identity Foundation, they're like this really interesting case study for these issues.
Definitely. It shows us that the search for meaning, for belonging, it can take all sorts of forms. And those forms are constantly changing, especially now in the digital age. The Science of Identity Foundation, with their blend of ancient wisdom and modern know-how, they're proof of that.
Well, we've certainly gone deep on this one, explored their origins, their controversial leader, their unique mix of beliefs, the range of experiences reported by members.
We've touched on lineage, spiritual authority, the whole question of individual freedom versus the potential for exploitation.
We even went into U.S. politics. uncovered that surprising connection. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And, we've learned a ton, but we've also raised a lot of questions. But that's the whole point of a deep dive, right? To spark curiosity, not to give all the answers.
Absolutely. We've given our listeners plenty to think about. Now it's up to them to keep exploring, to form their own opinions, to keep asking those tough questions.
Because, at the end of the day, the most valuable thing you can take away from this is a sense of curiosity and a willingness to grapple with complexity, to realize that the world isn't black and white. That truth has many sides.
Couldn't agree more. And with that, we'll leave our listeners with this final thought. The journey of understanding doesn't end here. Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep seeking those deeper insights.
The more we learn, the more we realize how much more there is to discover.
Mm.
And that's what makes it all so fascinating.
Well said. And on that note, we'll sign off. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.